All right, let's jump right into a core truth about investing that, honestly, most of us tend to forget. We like to think of it as this solo journey, right? It's just you against the market. But that's not really how it works. It's more like a game. And for every single trade you make, there is always someone on the other side taking the opposite bet. So the question you have to ask yourself is, who is that person?
And look, this might be the most important question you can ever ask before you click that buy or sell button. Seriously. Because if you don't know who you're playing against, if you can't clearly, simply state what your advantage is in that trade, well then the odds are pretty high that you don't have one. You might just be what they call the sucker at the table, the easy money for a pro on the other side.
A great way to think about this is like a tennis match. On one side of the net, you've got the pro. They're calm, they've got a strategy, every move is deliberate. And then on the other side, you've got the amateur. Maybe they're a little frantic, making a lot of unforced errors. Well, in the market, that's the dynamic we see playing out all the time between the big institutions, the pros, and individual investors.
And don't get me wrong, the stakes in this game are incredibly high. This isn't just some theory. A huge, super detailed study looked at every single investor in Taiwan over a long period, and what they found was, wow. While the big institutions were consistently making money, the average individual investor, they lost 3.8% a year. That's the real-world cost of being the amateur in this match.
Okay, but here's the crucial part, and it's actually really good news. You don't need some secret inside information to win this game. You really don't. The real opportunity, your real edge, comes from something called analytical inefficiency. It's a fancy term for a simple idea. You gain an advantage by taking the exact same public information everyone else has and just analyzing it better, thinking about it more clearly. That's where the real edge is found.
All right, so let's get practical. How do we start building that edge? Well, the very first place to look is inside our own heads. We need to understand the subtle psychological biases that trip all of us up, because this is where most of those unforced errors we talked about, this is where they come from.
So, picture this. It's a classic scenario. A stock you've been watching suddenly just takes off. It's soaring. That's a huge positive piece of news, right? So what does your brain do with that information? Well, how you process it actually reveals two really powerful and kind of contradictory biases we all have.
So the first thing your brain tries to do is what we call inference. It takes that big signal, the soaring stock price, and it asks, okay, what does this say about the quality of the company itself? But here's the crazy part. Studies show we consistently underreact. We see this massive positive event, but we only slightly adjust our fundamental belief about how good the company is. We're too anchored to our old opinion. But then, almost immediately, your brain flips a switch to a second task, forecasting. Now you're thinking, okay, where is the stock price going to be tomorrow? And here, we do the complete opposite. We overreact. We take that same piece of recent news and we just extrapolate it out to infinity, thinking the momentum will never stop. We get way too optimistic.
Now, what's fascinating is that these biases aren't even consistent. They change depending on the situation. If you look at this table, check out that time horizon row. When it comes to forecasting, it shows we actually underreact to short-term news, but overreact to long-term trends. I mean, it's a mess. The big takeaway here is just that our brains are not naturally wired to get this right. But being aware of that flaw, that's the first step to actually fixing it.
Okay, that brings us to our second source of edge, and honestly, this one might be the most powerful of all. It's also probably the hardest to pull off, and it's all about using time, specifically a different time horizon, as your ultimate weapon. So the reason this is an edge comes down to a powerful bias called myopic loss aversion. We all know this intuitively, right? A loss hurts way more than an equal-sized gain feels good, maybe twice as much. So when people are constantly checking their portfolios and seeing those little day-to-day losses, it's painful. And that pain makes them demand much higher returns just to stick with it. But what if you could just sidestep that pain entirely?
Well, let's look at the math. If you're checking your portfolio every single day, you've got about a 46% chance of seeing that it's down. That is almost a coin flip. It means every other day, you're getting hit with that dose of psychological pain, which just pushes you to make reactive, short-term decisions.
But now, watch what happens when you just zoom out. What if you only checked your portfolio once a year? Suddenly, the chance of seeing a gain jumps all the way to 75%. Just like that, you've cut out most of that emotional pain from the equation.
And this is where it gets really powerful. If you zoom out to a 15-year horizon, the historical probability of making a profit in a diversified portfolio gets incredibly close to 100%. Think about that. By simply changing how often you look, you can basically disarm one of the biggest psychological traps in all of investing. So you gotta be asking, right? If it's that simple, why doesn't everyone do it? Why is a true long-term view so rare? Well, the famous economist John Maynard Keynes absolutely nailed it. He said it's better for your reputation to fail in a conventional way than to succeed unconventionally. For professional money managers, there is immense pressure to perform this quarter. It's literally safer for their job to lose money along with everyone else than to look weird for a while, even if they end up being right. And that career risk, it makes true patience a really scarce, and therefore, really valuable edge. All right, let's talk about the third major source of edge. This one is all about the stories the market tells itself. I'm talking about these powerful, sweeping narratives that can sometimes matter even more than the balance sheets. Stories that literally move trillions of dollars. And there's no better case study for this than a company we all know, Alphabet or Google. What happened with them over just a couple of years is a masterclass in how a complete reversal in the market story about their AI created one of the biggest swings in value the world has ever seen. So think back to late 2022, ChatGPT launches, and overnight the story about Google is one of fear. Are they obsolete? Are they being left behind in AI? That story got even worse when they had a clumsy launch for their own AI, Bard. But then, fast forward a bit, they released their much more powerful Gemini model, and just like that, the entire narrative flips 180 degrees. The story goes from fear to inevitable dominance. And look, this wasn't just talk on financial news. It had a direct, massive impact on the price people were willing to pay for the stock. You can see it right here in the price-to-earnings multiple. When the narrative was fear, investors would only pay maybe 18 times what the company earned in a year. But once that story flipped to dominance, they were suddenly willing to pay almost 30 times. We're talking about the same company, roughly the same earnings, but a completely different price, all because the story changed. So, what's the bottom line? That simple shift in the story, from fear to dominance, added an unbelievable $1.8 trillion to Alphabet's market value. That is not a typo. That is the power of a market narrative. Okay, so let's tie all of this together into something you can actually use. How do you apply these ideas? Here's a simple 4-part playbook for building your own analytical edge. First, find easy games. Always ask who's on the other side of your trade. Second, get better at updating your beliefs. Know when your brain is inferring versus when it's forecasting and fight those biases. Third, and this is the big one, use time as your edge. Just by extending your time horizon, you can sidestep so many psychological traps. And fourth, learn to anticipate narratives. Pay attention to the market's big stories and look for places where they might not match up with reality. And I really want to hammer home that third point about time, because as the legendary investor Cliff Asness once said, a true long-term perspective is the closest you can come to possessing an investing superpower. And for you, as an individual investor, this is without a doubt your single greatest potential advantage over the pros. And really, all of this, it brings us to one final question for you to take with you. The goal here isn't to perfectly predict the future. Nobody can do that. The goal is just to see the present a little more clearly than most other people. So I'll leave you with this to chew on. What is the big, powerful market narrative that pretty much everyone believes is true today that just might be completely wrong?